Okay, so welcome everyone to the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany. And I'm here tonight to kind of give the first in a series of lectures that we're doing to complement the fact that we have upstairs on view some of the Quinnipiac collection, the Irish Great Hunger. So there's a new museum, coming in Fairfield, Connecticut, and we've teamed up with them to have this exhibition on loan until the end of May. So it'll be an opportunity for people not in Connecticut to see some of these pieces. And while they're here, we thought we would do a series of talks. So tonight we are, oh God, tonight we are talking about the overview one. And sorry, somebody is just getting lost in something here. Hang on. Okay. I just had a frantic email there from somebody. So tonight I'm going to talk to you just an overview of the Great Hunger. Next week on the 5th, we've got Cian McMahon. He's going to be talking about the coffin ships. And then on the 21st, we have Loretta O'Leary from Ireland's Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield, Connecticut, to discuss the Staten Island quarantine station. So a lot of those kind of, very topical issues still. Of course, famine is happening all over the world still, and the response to immigrants and sickness and things, refugees. So very, very topical. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get cracking. And if you have any questions or comments, don't forget you can put them at the end down at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button or a chat button. And I hope I'm not blocking my own camera. So by 1841, Ireland was the most densely populated country in Europe, with about 8.1 million residents who were recorded in that year's census. By the end of the Great Hunger, officially, I suppose, in 1852, the population had been reduced to 6.5 million. So at least 1 million had died, either from starvation or related diseases like typhus, typhoid, and fever. At least another 1 million immigrated in those years, and that immigration kind of deluge continued until by 1855, 2.1 million had left the country. After the Act of Union in 1800, Ireland, of course, was ruled directly from London, but bitter sectarianism, terrible economic conditions after the Napoleonic Wars, and class conflict meant that it was treated as a colony rather than as part of the United Kingdom. Much of the poorer peasantry of Ireland lived as tenants on estates owned by Anglo-Irish and English landlords. The landlords' estates generated up to £3 million in annual income from rent, much of that going to absentee landlords whose estates were often managed by local agents in Ireland. Years of systemic neglect from the British government, appalling living conditions, and a huge underclass of landless cottiers, which were people who raised potatoes or other crops on very tiny plots, which they had sub-rented from other people, and who were occasionally able to earn from their day labor, ensured that the Irish peasant was in a continuous subsistence crisis and on the verge of starvation. Although the potato was not native to Ireland, the vegetable was well suited to Irish conditions and flourished even in damp soil. So you can see here, Thomas Malthus said that to give full effect to the natural resources of the country, a great part of the population should be swept from the soil. So, there was an awareness just on the eve of the famine that really the country couldn't sustain the population it had. So the potatoes, sorry, I have to get back out into my form. Yeah. The potatoes allowed the cottier class to feed themselves from increasingly small holdings. There you can see some of the famous landlords' houses, and just the difference, between where peasants lived and the landlord lived. And so by 1845, potatoes made up 90% of the diet of at least 1/3 of the population. So in some parts of Ireland, a grown man's diet consisted of 14 pounds of potatoes eaten every day, but particularly in winter, with the addition of milk or maybe some other buttermilk, a little bit of bacon to enhance the flavour. And so between 1700 and the Great Hunger, there were actually 27 either partial or total failures of the potato crop, and deadly famines occurred in 1817 and 1822, which was compounded by a cholera outbreak in 1832. In 1845, a new strain of potato disease, Phytophthora infestans, appeared across Europe. So it wasn't just in Ireland. Less than 50% of the harvest was destroyed in that autumn harvest, and the British government, under Sir Robert Peel, implemented a number of relief measures, including the importation of Indian corn. Operating in tandem with a new poor law, which saw the country divided into 130 poor law unions, these measures were supposed to be short-term. A scientific commission was implemented to investigate the blight and research remedies for the disease, but a solution could not be found. And then, when the blight reappeared in the following year, earlier in the season, it occurred in 45 in September, and in 46 occurred in a more toxic form, it resulted in 90% of the crop being destroyed. And then it transformed this temporary food shortage, which many had learned to live with over decades, into a major subsistence crisis, and one which the government was really not prepared for. So the Peel government was quick to respond to the crisis initially in 1845, and in 1846, a Central Relief Commission was established to raise funds to purchase food and install depots. The Coast Guard opened 76 depots along the west coast under Peel's administration to import food and to try to distribute it. The first public works schemes began under the Irish Board of Works to provide employment for the destitute as early as December in 1845. Peel also used the food shortages in Ireland to reverse the protection that had been provided by tariffs on imported corn. Now, his own party, the Conservatives, saw that as a betrayal of land interests, and he was very quickly replaced by Lord John Russell, leader of the Whig Party. Faced now in 46 with a second year of food shortages, the expectation was that the Whig government would intervene, and Russell declared in the House of Commons in 1846 that he would use the whole credit of the Treasury to avert famine and maintain the people of Ireland. However, relief measures continued to be overseen by the Treasury, which was led by a civil servant, this man here, Charles Trevelyan. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Charles Wood, shared Trevelyan's providentialist view of the famine. So they advocated a minimalist approach to relief for Ireland and refused to intervene in the marketplace. Irish and British merchants used the food shortages to maximize their profits rather than help get food to starving people. And it's very important to kind of emphasize the point here that, again, you're talking about the failure of one crop. It wasn't really a famine. Butter reached record prices throughout this time. Pork, did. And so if you were a storekeeper or a bigger farmer and you weren't reliant on the potato, it was no problem for you. Like, you had other ways to feed yourself. But poor people, particularly that cottier, landless class, were dependent on the potato, first of all, because if they were raising livestock, they sold it generally once a year to pay their rent. Same thing with things like boats and fishing nets. They pawned those at the start of 1846, assuming that it would be a short-term measure. And so, when people ask why didn't they fish, first of all, they couldn't because they pawned their boats or their nets. And second of all, of course, oftentimes on rivers especially, the landlord owned the rights to fish. And so you were technically poaching if you were, fishing without a license or outside of the times. So it's a more complicated, question than just a famine. The government did introduce a temporary relief act, the Soup Kitchen Act, in 1847, in the January, and of course 1847 was known as Black 47, and it provided cooked food to people who waited in line, and it was operated by a combination of the poor law unions, kind of out of that workhouse system, parish or electoral division relief committees set up by local taxpayers, and the central government. In the summer of 1847, more than 3 million people used these food rations, which cooked food, very handy. You just went with a pot, and took some home. And it cost the government 1.75 million. But a disastrous change was to occur in the administration of relief with the introduction of the now infamous Gregory Clause. And this meant that the able-bodied would only receive relief from within the workhouse system. So they would have to give up their land if they owned anything more than a quarter of an acre and go into the workhouse. And the infirm or the old or widowed could retain their holdings and receive outdoor relief. So now, instead of giving poor people access to cheap food, the Whig government decided also that public works centred on physical labour would be the main method of providing relief. In a system that was vastly unsuitable for the reality of a weak and starving people, building programs were organised across the country. And enfeebled people broke stones and built roads which went nowhere and were paid a daily wage based on their output. Yeah, so you can see here the Quakers, you know, who toured Ireland at the time, are kind of giving out about poor people who are having to, particularly girls, you know, working these physical labours. And it wasn't unheard of for men to just absolutely, you know, pass out and die at the side of the road as they were building these roads. So physical demands upon these frail and hungry bodies, combined with low wages and scant clothing, had disastrous results. Administrative difficulties, the expense of overseeing the system, and the resultant inability to farm the land while people were labouring on public works led to the government actually ceasing the scheme in the middle of 1847, just a few months in. And furthermore, while the poor law would remain responsible for all relief measures under the maxim Irish property must pay for Irish poverty, now those measures would be funded by taxes raised in Ireland and not Britain. And this, of course, has a dire impact on the landlord's desire and ability to help. British administrators in Ireland pleaded for help from the government in London, but were met with a dogmatic London administration that placed moralistic and economic arguments and policies above the profound moral objective of saving lives. So approximately 70 of the 100 members representing Ireland in the House of Commons were wealthy landed proprietors in Ireland, while a number of titled Irish landlords sat in the House of Lords also. Now, of necessity, of course, these groups spent much of their time in London rather than on their estates in Ireland. But almost every poor law union and relief committee in the country had either a landlord or an agent acting on his behalf sitting on the Board of Guardians administering the workhouse. Without this presence, loans from the government would have been difficult to draw down and relief works would not have proceeded. But the cost of those loans and the high poor law rates made necessary by having a workhouse and an outdoor relief scheme were expensive. And landlords attended the meetings as much to protect their own interests as they did to relieve the needy. There were, of course, so you can see here, this is part of the problem. The Cork Examiner, you know, issued this editorial in 1848 accusing the landlords of doing everything they could to evade the payment of their rates. That means their taxes. Now, so while in general landlords or their agents, probably more fittingly their agents to be honest, have a very bad reputation, there were some who sought to ameliorate their tenants' conditions, and charitable behaviour was demonstrated through rent reductions, distribution of seed and crops, employment on the estates, immigration assistance, which of course was a double-edged sword, and contributions to soup kitchens, and family members often distributed blankets or clothing and bread. Elizabeth Smith, the wife of a landlord in County Wicklow, who was from Scotland herself, was known particularly for her generosity during the Great Hunger and the aid she provided. She also, more importantly, publicly criticised the government's response to the crisis occasionally. But there is no doubt that the Gregory Clause was enthusiastically used by landlords as a means of ridding themselves of destitute tenants. And so the Cork Examiner in Black 47 published, "Is it not strange, when all parties dread a recurrence of last winter's horrors, that picnic parties and balls were never, even in the midst of plenty, of such frequent occurrence in this place?" Now, the interesting thing about Black 47, there wasn't actually really a blight that year, but because 90% of the crop had been destroyed in 46, there was very little planted in 47. So this is actually the worst of the years. Again, not so much because of the blight, but because of the combination of no new growth and the ending of that outdoor relief. Dennis Mahon is probably one of the more famous landlords. He was landlord here at Strokestown in County Roscommon, which today is the National Famine Museum at home. And like many of the estates in Ireland at the time, it had already been severely mismanaged and was already in debt before the famine. With 11,000 tenants on 11,500 acres, Mahon and his agent, John Ross Mahon, approached families and basically encouraged them to emigrate to Canada. And in return, he would forgive them their unpaid rents. They would receive compensation for their crops. The cottages would be leveled to make room for a smarter system of farming, but he would pay for their passage. 1,490 people accepted, and they departed on 2 different ships. But unfortunately, when it became common knowledge that a third of the immigrant tenants perished either during the crossing or on the island of Gros Isle, which was the quarantine station in Canada, tensions at home ran high. Another 3,000 tenants were then evicted, and Mahon was killed on November 2nd in 1847, the first of 6 landlords to be killed during the Great Hunger. Now, of course, one of the knock-on effects that this has was that landlords felt the pinch quite quickly too. By 1844, before even the famine, the courts of Chancery and the Exchequer had already assumed responsibility for 1,322 properties across Ireland, which had been so sorely mismanaged that official oversight was needed. These estates had annual rents of £1 million. The situation was so grave that by 1849, Parliament passed the Encumbered Estates Act, which created a special court empowered to purchase a debt-ridden estate and vest them with indefeasible title. The landlord who purchased a new title received the estate cleared of debt. But the new law provided no compensation to tenants, particularly if they had carried out, improvements to the holdings during his tenure. And so new owners routinely raised the rents and carried out mass evictions. The intended goal of the legislation was to allow professional businessmen, technically resident in Ireland, to take over the management of the land of Ireland. And so 90% of the 8,000 new buyers were Irishmen who were speculators in land interest, and they were intent on making a profit. Passage of the Act sounded not only the death toll for Ireland's bankrupt Anglo-Irish landlords, but for those small holding tenants who had managed in the face of incredible odds to survive the famine and retain their farms, and now facing themselves evicted in the 1850s. The misery of the Great Hunger was, of course, exacerbated by the rate of evictions, which had already been accelerating in the decade before 1845, as new legislation had made it less costly and less cumbersome for landlords to evict certain categories of tenants. So in 1843, the amendment to the Poor Law meant that landlords were responsible for paying rates on holdings valued at £4 and less. And I was saying to you, like, a lot of the land had been subdivided. So a lot of landlords had a lot of these subdivided holdings. And then the infamous Gregory Clause prohibited any relief for families who held more than 1/4 of an acre. So those two things combined facilitated the great clearance that happened over the decade after the famine. Capitalising on the disaster of the potato blight and subsequent hunger, evictions and levelling of houses intensified in a process which was in keeping with the British government's policy of agrarian Anglicisation in Ireland. We know that a British government inquiry in the 1880s reported that maybe 900,000 families had been evicted from Ireland in the previous 50 years, but it doesn't specify how many of those occurred during the Great Hunger. The constabulary were only expected to record evictions occurring after 1849. So figures for evictions during the Great Hunger remain unclear, although several historians estimate that it's likely between 250,000 or 580,000 people at least were evicted. To ensure that the evicted could not return to what remained of their cabins, landlords tumbled the roofs or had the foundations dug up. James Mahoney, a reporter with the London paper who was a Cork man, claimed that the subsequent deserted villages looked like the tombs of a departed race rather than the recent abodes of a yet living people. Now, evictors came from every walk of life. It was not just the absentee landlords who removed people from their homes, because a common problem, of course, was the subdivision of land when middlemen held the main lease and then sublet smaller holdings to numerous other tenants. But schools, colleges, other institutions, doctors and wealthy merchants were often landlords too, and they sometimes depended on their rental income to conduct whatever their other business was. Trinity College, for instance, was the largest landholder in Ireland that had almost 200,000 acres, and it evicted 600 people from their land in Kerry. Clergy members were among those who cleared their estates, with Church of Ireland rectors in Offaly, the Reverend James Paul Holmes and the Reverend William Minchin evicting several families. In 1852, the Catholic priest Dr. Daly, Bishop of Cashel, was said to have resorted to the crowbar instead of the crozier when he evicted 35 families from his own estate in Waterford. Agents and middlemen, as well as the police, were often called to the scene of an eviction and were without mercy when they tumbled cottages, often destroying the contents of the houses too. Hut tumblers were reviled by the locals, and their involvement in this aspect of the misery of those years was long remembered. So I had put up a speech bubble a minute ago. It is true, most of the bum bailiffs were always of the lowest type of humanity, but a few were constrained to accept this miserable occupation, urged by the thought of the oppression or cruelty exercised towards themselves or relatives a short time before, so that there was therefore a grudge and now a way to exercise it, but by this stroke of getting under the protection of the landlord and having the power at their back. Eviction in these circumstances was usually a sentence of death, especially because access to overcrowded workhouses was becoming less and less likely. Families burrowed into boggy ground, digging a sort of cave called a scalp, but they were often chased out of those too. So you can see there that turf hut is kind of a very temporary. While newspapers initially reported in great detail about individual families who were caught up in the tragedy, by 1849, these clearings had become so ubiquitous that they simply noted the sale of furniture or household objects, which indicated another eviction. And so Lord Brougham made a speech in the House of Lords in 1846, which said, "It is the landlord's right to do as he pleases. These tenants must be taught by the strong arm of the law that they have no power to oppose or resist." And there was a speech bubble a minute ago. Nothing could be more distressing than to hear the clanking of the crowbars demolishing the cabins, which were mingled with the most pitiful and heart-rending shrieks of women and children. And that was witnesses at the evictions on Lord Clonmel's Tipperary estate. So American charity through Ireland. International and domestic charity swung into action very quickly in response to the need in Ireland. And again, it's very interesting because the blight was actually across Europe. It wasn't just Ireland that was affected. American officials in London and Ireland reported on the bleak conditions of Ireland to President James Polk and his Secretary of State, James Buchanan. While the horrific descriptions were mainly used to predict increased demand for American food, and don't forget they were importing Indian corn, as it was called, from America, the US Congress debated legislation that would have provided federal relief for the suffering in Ireland. On the 8th of February in 1847, Congressman Washington Hunt of New York introduced an Irish relief measure to his legislative colleagues. The bill was read twice and then sent to a special committee, where it died. Aware of the abortive attempt in the House, Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed the same bill in the Senate on the 26th of February in 1847, which passed and made its way to the floor of the House of Representatives for approval. But it was defeated in the House, even though President Polk had already planned to veto it if it passed, because he claimed Congress possesses no power to use public money for any such purpose. So despite the official silence, the American public was galvanized to help. The Jamestown was the first vessel to sail to Ireland from America under the auspices of the Boston Relief Committee, who spent a month collecting donations for the voyage. By the time of loading on St. Patrick's Day in 1847, the committee had 800 tons of foodstuffs, comprised mainly of Indian corn and bread, but including potatoes, flour, rye, beans, rice, oatmeal, ham, and pork. And there were 16 barrels of clothing. A distribution committee shared the food throughout Cork and its 160 districts, including the most devastated areas like Skibbereen, Cove, and Kinsale. A report published by the Society of Friends showed that 118 vessels sailed to Ireland with US relief goods valued at over $500,000, sorry. The report did not include private relief donations of friends and relatives, which were repatriated directly to victims. And there can be no denying that those repatriations from people already in America were absolutely vital for some of the families who received them. Because sometimes it was in the form of a ticket, you know, so it got them out of the misery. And so with that additional assistance, it is estimated that America raised millions of dollars for Ireland. Only a few short years after the Trail of Tears decimated the Choctaw Nation, which infamously saw some Irish men working as soldiers on that campaign, they famously collected $170, which was sent first to the Memphis Irish Relief Committee and then to the General Irish Relief Committee of the City of New York. The gift was recognized as extraordinary even at the time, and the chairman of the New York Committee specifically mentioned it in his reports to the Central Relief Committee in Ireland. Now, these Central Relief Committees had been set up by the Quakers, or the Society of Friends in Dublin, on the 13th of November in 1846 to try to coordinate the work of various branches already working in Cork, Clonmel, Limerick and Waterford. They circulated an appeal for funds, food and clothing with the object of affording, quote, the largest amount of good with the means at our disposal. Quaker investigators travelled the country and their published reports refuted charges that accounts of distress were exaggerated. Refusing to give their resources to the poor law unions, Quaker soup kitchens operated throughout the country. And they distributed seed, fishing nets, yarns and clothing. Perhaps the most significant contribution they made was to the legislation regarding the encumbered estates in 1849, when the Central Relief Committee Secretary, Jonathan Pym, heavily advocated for its passage. Now, naturally, with private charity, while it assuredly saved countless lives, soup kitchens were sometimes tarnished by a minority of evangelical proselytizers who encouraged Catholics to convert to Protestantism before they could receive food. Even though this activity was seriously condemned at the time, the existence of souperism cast a dark cloud on the memory of private charity, and people who allegedly took the soup were often outcast in their communities and were remembered as supers or turncoats for generations afterwards. So this is one of the most kind of infamous proselytizer, Reverend Edward Nangle, who said that, you know, popery is idolatry, and so you know, he wouldn't encourage Catholics to be given the soup without converting. The workhouse. So the workhouse is probably one aspect of the famine which is still incredibly fraught at home in Ireland. You know, for a long time, Eamon de Valera called them a blight on the landscape. And so even though they had been used into the 20th century, sometimes as hospitals and TB stations, occasionally mother and baby homes, a lot of them had actually been knocked or removed, you know. And so this has a very kind of visceral memory for a lot of the older people in Ireland. So you can see there that the governing principle of the workhouse is that the support in the workhouse should be on the whole less desirable than the support to be obtained by independent exertion. It would perhaps be in vain, even if it were desirable, to seek to make the lodging, the clothing and the diet of the inmates of an Irish workhouse inferior to those of the Irish peasantry. But the standard of their mode of living is unhappily so low that the establishment of one still lower is difficult and would, I think, under any circumstances be inexpedient. Workhouses were established in Ireland following the passage of the Poor Laws in 1838. The concept had, of course, originated in England, in part because of the growing industrialization of that country, and it was meant to provide motivation to work for those who were able, and it would dissuade vagrancy. So this made sense in a growing industrial centre, but in an agricultural country like Ireland, the workhouse system was a much poorer fit because they were very rarely farmed out to work. Initially, 130 workhouses were built around Ireland between 1840 and 1847. Another 33 would be added in the 1850s to help relieve the burden on the existing houses, which lacked the capacity to take in the large numbers of people seeking relief from hunger. Already during the Great Hunger, the workhouse in a town was supplemented by auxiliary buildings or sheds, which were often rented to accommodate the males especially. Each workhouse, and you can see here how it's divided up into kind of barracks. There's a better plan. Each workhouse was contained dorms, basically for men, women, boys, and girls who were separated from each other by age, and families and married couples separated. It often included a chapel, there was a dining area, an infirmary, and a laundry, sometimes a schoolroom. Grey and imposing, workhouses were meant as a last resort for the truly suffering, and the poor living that they were given there with these minimal rations and hard jobs to occupy them, and speaking to each other during mealtimes was often forbidden. The labour included breaking stones, grinding meal, or sometimes farming land around the house for the men. Women did laundry and tended to the sick. But it was, sometimes they did kind of foolish work like unpicking rope for profit for other people. Sometimes they were made to sew things, for hotels and bigger employers in towns. And with that money, was shared between the workhouse and whoever employed them. The nature of these buildings, because they went up very quickly, led to issues of poor quality in their construction, issues that would become more and more obvious as they filled during those early years of the Great Hunger. And Sidney Osborne, who travelled in Ireland during 1849, said these workhouses are theatres in which much gross cruelty is forever enacted. They are rank schools of evil. No human ingenuity could contrive more powerful machinery to degrade human nature than that now contained, and at full work within the houses for relief of the poor in very many of the unions in the west of Ireland. And you can see this is people trying to get in. And we talked earlier on about the reluctance of people to go into them, in 46 and 47. But as the years went by, it was a kind of a desperate refuge. Overcrowding due to increased evictions and, of course, extreme poverty quickly became the norm in workhouses after 1846. Houses which had been built to accommodate 700 people soon ballooned to holding well over 1,000. And these were housed, as I said, in like sheds and other auxiliary buildings. The lack of space meant that many who arrived seeking help had to be turned away. And the close quarters, of course, became fertile ground for disease. So much so that workhouses were forced to add fever hospitals in addition to the infirmary. While deaths were not unknown in workhouses before the Great Hunger, the rates skyrocketed between 1845 and 1852. So between 1842, when the first houses opened, and 1845, not even 5,000 people, 4,944 people had died in workhouses, a rate of just over 1,000 a year. In 1846 alone, there was 14,662 deaths in the workhouse. And the following year, the death rate reached its peak with 68,890 deaths just in workhouses. By its end, 1/3 of the million who died in the years of the famine had died in the workhouse. Due to the scale of the deaths and the destitution of their families, many were not given a proper burial and were instead buried in mass graves at the workhouse. There's a quote again from Sidney Osborne, who says the infirmary and dysentery wards were sad spectacles. They were not only overcrowded, but the cases were of a very bad type. There was one dysentery shed for children. I was told they had 107 patients in it. The appearance of these poor things was sad in the extreme. They were far too closely packed, especially patients with a complaint which almost forbids cleanliness. He's talking about the vomiting and the diarrhea. There was one bed with 4 children in it. One of them, quite naked, lay on his back, a mere skin which was over the bones. So these close quarters, of course, meant that everything was highly contagious and massively spread. And this meant too that, doctors and nurses and the priests who attended were also getting sick. We'll come back to this picture. So at the height of the Great Hunger, Prime Minister Russell refused to provide an estimate of deaths in the House of Commons, suggesting that measurement was impossible because, quote, a man found dead in the fields would probably be mentioned in the police returns as having died of starvation. Of course, there's a very good chance that he did die of starvation at that time. The scholarly consensus is that roughly 1 million died of famine-related causes between 1846 and 51, making the Great Hunger exceptional in relative terms. It was definitely Europe's greatest natural disaster of the 19th century. Most deaths were due to diseases like typhus rather than starvation per se, although dysentery and scurvy are related to lack of food. Infants often died of dropsy or marasmus, which was a form of severe protein energy malnutrition. Hunger-related deaths were, of course, largely limited to the poor, but infectious diseases meant that clergy, medical staff, and even poor law personnel who were inspecting the places were naturally exposed. Of course, births declined because of a hunger-induced absence of menstruation in the women. There was illness, of course, spousal separation because of migration and death, or postponed marriages and social disruption all led to a lower birth rate or to a huge infant mortality rate. So the Great Hunger changed the attitude to death and burial for most people. You can see here, sorry, that's just to show you that, you know, the vicar sits while Mullins lies in the corner. Mullins died, and then 3 days later, so too the vicar. And then in a short time, a doctor gave testimony to the Dublin Medical Press in 1848. The face and limbs become frightfully emaciated. The eyes acquire a most peculiar stare. The skin exhaled a peculiar and offensive feature, which was covered with a brownish, filthy-looking coating, almost as indelible as varnish. This I was at first inclined to regard as encrusted filth, but further experience has convinced me that this is a secretion poured out from the excellence on the surface of the body. And you know, they're absolutely everywhere in the records, doctors talking about, you know, how the patients are dying, and maybe the only thing they have to soothe them is possibly some whiskey if they're lucky. You know, there was very little medication to be given. So I was saying that the Great Hunger changed the attitude to death and burial. The ritual of sitting with the corpse and the family, which was an important part of communal grieving, because wakes were as much a celebration of life as it was a lamentation. Keening, storytelling, music, and song were symbolic manifestations of community values and beliefs, and had already come under criticism from Victorian and Protestant mores. At the height of the Great Hunger, when mortality soared through various diseases, but particularly things like smallpox or cholera, famine, or road fever, as it was called, which was often transmitted through lice, which fed on dirty people. And all of those diseases led to hemorrhages or other discharges, causing a rotting smell to be discharged from the person as they lay dying. So it wasn't, you know, pleasant to be around, but it was also highly contagious. Afraid of contagion or too weak to bury people, corpses sometimes lay where they fell and had their cabin pulled down around them. Bodies were found in fields with their mouths stained green from eating grass. Animals often ate the bodies, and sometimes the dying shared a bed with somebody who was long dead. The death toll was so high that corpses were disposed of without a shroud, usually in the cases of the workhouses, in a hinged coffin, which was then reused without wakes or prayers. Sometimes families retrieved a corpse from the mass graves in the workhouse and reburied them secretly at night in an unmarked grave in the graveyard attached to the church. So this is my hometown, and this is our famine graveyard in Listowel. There was probably about 4,000 people buried in that mass grave, and we know the names of only 3 have survived. Murren the dancer, Buckley the fiddler, and Paddy the gashk, which means hero kind of, or jockey. You can see here from Kenmare and County Kerry. One day Stephen Regan met a dog dragging a child's head along. He took the head from the dog and buried it and set a tree over it. The family to whom the child belonged were getting relief for the child, and so for that reason did not report the death, because they needed the food that they were supposed to be getting, you know, to sustain this child. So it goes to show you, like, the portions were just not enough, this Indian meal that they were getting. In the same vicinity was the bed of a little orphan girl who had crept into a hole in the bank, and she died one night with no one to close her eyes or wash her and fit her for the grave. She died unheeded. The dogs lacerated the body, gnawed at the bones, and strewed them about the bog. That was an eyewitness, Asenath Nicholson, who was an American philanthropist touring Ireland in 1847. And then Ireland's Agony collected this story. Family members commonly dragged bodies to cemeteries, sometimes wrapped in sugons, that kind of basket, you know, which were straw ropes. Such burials took place mostly at night, as families sought to conceal their shame at being unable to provide for members, either in life or in death. And when the schools collection came out in 1937 and 1945, I think, there was questions asked about the Great Hunger for the first time, really, and a lot of those, they're searchable online, and UCD have the archives. And a lot of the eyewitnesses talk about, or their descendants, talk about lights being on at the graveyard kind of all night as people reburied their dead. So the eyewitnesses kind of and reports at the time. So this is from Nicholas Cummins, who was a Cork magistrate, and he wrote an open letter on Christmas Eve in 1846, so quite early, to the Duke of Wellington, who had been born in Dublin. In the first hovel, he said, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearance dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering what seemed a ragged horsecloth, their wretched legs hanging about naked above the knees. I approached with horror and found by their moaning they were alive. They were in fever, 4 children and a woman, and what once had been a man. It is impossible to go through the detail. Suffice it to say that in a few minutes I was surrounded by at least 200 of such phantoms, such frightful spectres as no words can describe. By far the greater number were delirious, either from famine or fever. Their demonic yells are still ringing in my ears, and their horrible images are fixed upon my brain. Government officials, representatives from various charities, journalists, medical staff, and landlords and their agents all recorded their encounters with the starving Irish at this time. There were very few, naturally, if any, photographic representations of the Great Hunger. Any existing photographs from that time are of public figures or street scenes and landscapes. But 2 Cork artists, James Mahoney, who I mentioned a little bit earlier on ago, and Daniel MacDonald, were responsible for the most significant visual records of the Great Hunger. In a series of sketches drawn on the spot in Skibbereen and Clonakilty in West Cork, commissioned by and published in the Illustrated London News in 1847, Mahoney roused public opinion to persuade the British government to take action to alleviate suffering among the poor. One of the scenes he described, the woman Bridget O'Donnell begging for money. We saw it earlier on. She was begging for money to bury her dead child, has been immortalized in several different modern representations, including actually in sculpture, and we have one of them on display upstairs. So he wrote, and in the paper, I started from Cork by the mail for Skibbereen and saw little until we came to Clonakilty, where the coach stopped for breakfast. And here, for the first time, the horrors of the poverty became visible in the vast number of famished poor who flocked around the coach to beg alms. Amongst them was a woman carrying in her arms the corpse of a fine child and making the most distressing appeal to the passengers for aid to enable her to purchase a coffin and bury her dear little baby. This horrible spectacle induced me to make some inquiry about her when I learned from the people of the hotel that each day brings dozens of such applicants into the town. And, Listowel was a little bit like this. Any of the towns that had a workhouse kind of became hubs because, Listowel, for instance, is surrounded by kind of farmland. We're 9 miles from the Atlantic coast on one side. The next town, Tralee, 17 miles away, had a workhouse as well. But that's a big hinterland of people from both County Limerick, and County Kerry, who would have to come in to a bigger town to take advantage of the workhouse. Horrific as Mahoney's work is, because his work includes the sketches of famished children digging for potatoes, which we saw earlier, Mullen's hut at Skull, the funeral at Shepperton Lakes, and Bridget O'Donnell begging with her dead child. Even he did not sketch the more macabre scenes which were recorded by the paper. MacDonald's, this painting here, an Irish peasant family discovering the blight of their store, was painted in 1847 and exhibited in London at the time. But it offers a very stylized, although reflective scene, showing the momentous event that was the loss of their harvest and the demise of an entire class of people and their way of life. But it's not, super traumatic. They're just kind of looking at potatoes. Irish newspapers employed special correspondents to report on eviction scenes, including James McCarthy, who was the proprietor of the Limerick Examiner, who wrote about the evictions in Limerick, Clare, and Tipperary. And sometimes he was attacked by the bailiffs who undertook the evictions, but McCarthy and others like him publicised the eviction before they happened, drumming up support from the public for the hapless victims, and sometimes were successful in getting them. So I've got a couple of more like eyewitness accounts. One, I don't think I put it up there. An inquest was held on Thursday last before Michael Perrin Esquire at the Presentation Convent on view of the body of Celia Griffin, a girl about 6 years of age who was from the village of Corandula. It appeared on evidence that the poor creature had been reduced to extreme poverty and that the family to whom she belonged, 8 in number, were all in the same pitiful condition. On the post-mortem examination made by Dr. Staunton, there was not a particle found in her stomach. She, with her father, mother, brothers, and sisters, had come to Galway about 6 weeks ago in the hope of obtaining some charitable relief, and during that period they had been begging on the streets. The parents of the deceased formerly resided on the estate of Thomas Martin Esquire and MP, Member of Parliament. When Dr. Staunton was called on, he found the deceased in a state of inanition, except an occasional convulsive action of convulsive action of the muscles, and her body might be said to be literally skin and bone, with all the appearance of starvation. She was so exhausted as not to be able to use the food supplied to her. The jury found that her death was caused for want of the common necessaries of life. This is from the Telegraph in Castlebar in Mayo in 1847. A few days ago, I entered a miserable cabin, dug out of the bog. A poor woman sat propped against the wall inside. The stench was intolerable, and on my complaining of it, the mother pointed to a sort of square bed in one corner. It contained the putrid, the absolutely melted away remains of her eldest son. On inquiry why she did not bury it, she assigned 2 reasons. First, she had not the strength to go out and acquaint the neighbours, and next, she waited till her other child would die, that they might bury both together. And Asenath Nicholson, that American philanthropist, again in 1847, and she has many kind of horrific sights that she saw with her own eyes. She wrote, he found a family, father, mother, and 2 children lying in close contact. The father was considerably decomposed. The mother, it appeared, had died last, and probably fastened the door, which was always the custom when all hope was extinguished. She got into the darkest corner and died where passersby could not see them. Such family scenes were quite common, and the cabin was generally pulled upon them for a grave. Yeah. So like these bodies, we don't really have the pictures at the time of the bodies, but we've seen enough of famine in the last, 40 or 50 years on TV from other countries to know, the tummy all swollen, the extremities very, very skinny, and just what it does, to them. So Ireland's massive population loss between 1845 and 1852 had 2 main components. Death and immigration, but there were differences in which areas were affected. So the communities most drastically affected by deaths were on the western sides, the unions, the workhouse unions and the counties from Mayo all the way down to Cork. And the least affected by death like that was Ulster, East Leinster and Waterford. And then it's almost flipped. The core immigration region at the time was centred on North Connacht and South Ulster and Longford in Leinster, with the region with the lowest level of immigration stretches from the west coast, from Galway to Kerry. So it kind of, and also from the east coast, from Derry through Dublin, Wexford and Waterford. So it looks like in those towns there was kind of enough middle class that they could stay and survive, or enough in between holdings. And the very poor died, they couldn't afford to leave, but there wasn't a huge push on those who were left to immigrate. Although we know, like I know in Listowel, a lot of them received, assisted passage to Australia, for instance, with the Earl Grey scheme. And we do know that, Lord Kenmare had evicted his people out to New York. So it's kind of the, and then up there in the more Dublin, like a lot of jobs in Dublin, but industrial jobs, same with the industrial north, a lot of those people took advantage and decided to leave. So it's just interesting what parts leave and what parts, kind of die. Of course, certain areas experienced high levels of both, and it is apparent that pain and suffering were combined in extraordinarily different ways across a social and economically diverse island at the time. The Illustrated London News said in April 52, the greater the numbers who immigrate in any one year, the larger amount of funds received in Ireland in the next to enable friends and relatives to follow to the land of plenty and independence. The potato failure is thus working a mighty revolution. This mighty immigration pays for itself. It seeks no aid from the public purse, but it should be remembered that it establishes itself in regions that owe no fealty to the Crown of England. So a veiled threat, kind of there. This is now gross eel in Canada. While figures are still contested today, by 1855, almost as many, certainly 2.1 million people had left Ireland to seek better prospects elsewhere. 1.5 million emigrated to the United States, crowding cities along the East Coast, but primarily New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, among others. Others found new homes in Canada, Australia, and Great Britain. In 1847, the exodus from Ireland became a mass riot, which, quote, bore all the hallmarks of panic and hysteria. It was less an immigration than a headlong flight of refugees. In fact, 90,150 passengers of the 98,649 who left and disembarked at Grosse Ile, Quebec, 6 of the 7 of those were Irish, of this 98,000 who landed in Quebec. As many as 17,477 of those died on board ship or in the quarantine station, which you're seeing here. And so Grosse Ile is the largest Irish Great Hunger mass grave outside of Ireland. So if this exodus goes on, as it is likely to go on, the United States will become very Irish. So in Ireland, there will still be, but on a colossal scale and in a new world, we must gird our loins to encounter the nemesis of 7 centuries misgovernment. To the end of time, 100 million spread over the largest inhabitable area in the world and confronting us everywhere by sea and land will remember that their forefathers paid tithe to the Protestant clergy, rent to absentee landlords, and a forced obedience to the laws which these had made. And this was in the Times, which was quoted in The Nation in May of 1860. So kind of a warning that, maybe Britain didn't care about Ireland, but it certainly should be worried about Irish Americans. Now, many who immigrated were not the poorest of the poor, who outside of assistant immigration from their landlords or the poor rates kind of guardians could not afford the cost of travel, and so they remained at home to die. Even still, though, if you could afford to go, the passage was not always easy. For many who could leave, despite their slightly higher economic standing, a month-long passage to the United States was harrowing and at times fatal. Ships that carried immigrants often were unsuited to carrying human passengers, having been cargo ships that were hastily retrofitted to include small, cramped bunks to hold as many passengers as possible in as small a space as possible. Navigation acts sought to put protection in place for immigrants, but were often loosely enforced. Ships were overcrowded and lacked sufficient food, water, and hygiene for passengers. Actually, you had to bring your own food on most of the time to sustain yourself through the voyage. And they would be given water and a very small kind of allowance of food. Infectious diseases easily spread among those on board, especially things like typhus. Often sufferers might not have had visible symptoms for over a week, and so seemingly healthy individuals boarded a ship only to spread the disease unknowingly when they became severely ill mid-route. The worst ships, which saw the largest spread of disease, often landed in Canada rather than the United States because of heavy fees charged by American cities for ships carrying diseased passengers. So Carolyn Chisholm was an English humanitarian out of Australia. She said, if the steerage passengers in a ship carrying from 300 to 600 have no convenience for washing their hands, which they have not, or if there are no water houses or bath places where they can go to, it is impossible for them to be in a state of cleanliness. So before immigrants are considered and classes as a filthy set and the blame is all put on pauperism, it should not be so, but on the neglect of those who do not provide the immigrants with the proper accommodation. And I was on a tour of some famine ship one time and they said, because they were in bunks, if it was anyway stormy, like they were locked in, usually in the dark, and the ship is, going like this and people are vomiting and having diarrhea. And where is that going to go if they literally can't get out of their own bunk? So the conditions were not great. But we'll have Cian McMahon on the 5th of February in here to talk about that. There's Lord Palmerston from Sligo, and here's Lord, we'll go back to Palmerston, the other fellas, Kenmare. So, however convoluted the relations between different varieties of Irish nationalism, the memory of the famine became the focal point around which crystallized Irish America's search for historical understanding of why they found themselves where they were. And that's a quote from Jolie's book and Marion Casey's book that I recommended at the start of the talk. So of the 1.8 million immigrants who landed in New York between 1847 and 51, 848,000 or 47% of those were Irish. Most of the rest were German. The 1850 American census showed that 26% of the total population of New York was born in Ireland. Immigration, of course, did not put an immediate end to the suffering of those escaping the Great Hunger. Those who survived the journey would now find themselves in quarantine following their landing. I just want to see if we put... Oh yeah, so look, I'll just show you. That's the Kenmare fella that I was talking about. So here we are. Yes, out of quarantine, arrivals in the United States found themselves facing an unfamiliar country where they might have little to no connection. Those who did have family or friends who had previously immigrated made use of newspaper advertisements to help connect them with loved ones. In the meantime, finding your way in a new city was often challenging. Ports were filled not only with the lost and scared immigrants, but criminals looking to take advantage of them, either through theft or by leading them to boarding houses which charged exorbitant fees, or which were in fact brothels, and many a girl was trapped in those brothels. In the 1840s, new laws and receiving centres were established in many American cities, offering protection for new immigrants, as well as services to help them find homes and employment. So the Irish Immigrant Aid Society and the German Immigrant Aid Society took over Castle Clinton, for instance, in New York, to try to, set them up. Even with these new services, the biggest factor in immigrants finding success in their new home was the connections available to them through earlier immigrants. Charitable societies aimed at helping new Irish immigrants were existing in the United States since the 1780s, with the establishment of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. These societies consisted of wealthier, more connected kind of members of the community who could aid the newly arrived. Those who moved into neighbourhoods that already housed immigrants from their same parish were able to save more and worked in similar industries. And these networks were very important to provide access to jobs and housing, as well as just simple support and social connections, which made life easier for new arrivals. The Irish found themselves struggling as an underclass because the United States in the 19th century was often not welcoming to immigrants and especially Catholics. So here's a picture of 5 Points in 1836. That building, this photograph was taken around the time of the Civil War, but it's housing from the 1850s. And that's the old brewery. If any of you saw that movie, Gangs of New York, that had kind of been turned into, a huge tenement almost, with people living in it. The Know Nothing Party, officially the Native American Party, was established in 1844 as a nativist party, which believed Catholics were a danger to American values and society. Their name came from members responding, "I know nothing," if they were questioned about belonging to the party. While progressive on some issues, the Nativist Party, or the Know Nothing Party, opposed Irish and German immigrants, both of whom were majority Catholic at the time and arriving in similar numbers. Similar anti-Irish sentiments could be seen in employment, as some business advertisements blatantly declared no Irish need apply. Irish women, who, unlike other immigrant groups, often made the journey on their own, found success working in the service industry, with estimates that they made up 2/3 of domestic servants in this country. However, even this apparent success was dominated by the derogatory Bridget stereotype, which was popular in cartoons and vaudeville shows of the latter half of the 19th century. The suspicion and rejection from Protestant Americans, as well as the close living quarters, however, allowed the Irish to build strong bonds that turned them from poor refugees fleeing starvation into a largely united political force. Recognition of the power behind this upwardly mobile demographic led to the rise of powerful political machines like the infamous Tammany Hall, which gained power largely through their support of Irish immigrants, whom they aided through employment and other programs to earn loyalty. Through newspapers, and becoming heavily involved in the music and vaudeville industries, prominent in cities like New York. Irish Americans were able eventually to take control of their popular image in the press and on stage, and they replaced rough, kind of insulting caricatures with flattering and more sentimental portraits. Having found themselves in some of the roughest, most dangerous jobs, mainly working on railroads, canals, and coal mines, as well as factories, they became the backbone of the labor movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, the famed activist Mother Jones had fled herself the Great Hunger with her family in 1847, and one of the creators of the Labor Day holiday, Peter Maguire, was the son of Irish immigrants. And so this is a picture of the St. Patrick's Day parade in the late 19th century. And on this one day in the year, the Irishman is a man. During the other 364 days, an Irishman feels himself curtailed of his fair proportions. But on this one day, he attains his full height. He does not slink into a corner. He does not conceal himself in the shade, lest people may think he is Irish. But he goes abroad in the plentitude of his stature, and he bears himself aloft, the equal head and shoulders of the proudest in the land. And that was published in Irish World in 1871. So, and I see there's a couple of questions coming out. I'm almost finished. I've half a page. In conclusion, we feel it will be gratifying to Your Excellency to find that although the population has been diminished in so remarkable a manner by famine, disease, and immigration, and has been since decreasing, the results of the Irish census are on the whole satisfactory. That was in the report of the commissioners of the 1851 census. So the Great Hunger and the immigrant communities that came out of it left a lasting impact, not just in Ireland, but of course also in the United States. Immigration to America continued for decades after the famine had ended, continuing well into the 20th century. This contributed to the ongoing decline of Ireland's population, which did not begin to see growth again until the 1950s. The hard core of the problem is the sad, stark fact that one Irish child, more than one statistically, in every 3 is born to immigrate and grows up in the knowledge that he or she must immigrate. The moral and psychological effect of that fact is immense. It paralyzes certain areas. It is dead weight upon the spirit of the whole country and a dead hand upon her economy. And that was from the Government of Ireland's Commission on Immigration and Other Population Problems in 1954. In Ireland, memories of the famine contributed to songs and folklore, with cleared estates and empty homes or empty villages serving as a reminder of the painful period. In some cases, the Great Hunger was considered shameful, leading to a lack of formal commemoration. Losing loved ones to the starvation caused by the blight or taking government aid could create a type of survivor's guilt alongside grief from the loss. The prolonged suffering from the many years of the famine and the mismanagement of aid projects undertaken by the government also helped stoke the fires of the land reform and independence movements that continued into the 1920s, bolstered now by support from the far-flung Irish diaspora across the globe. Throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries, the political and economic growth gained by earlier Irish Americans through their community connections helped many move out of the cramped and unsafe tenements that they'd lived in as they increasingly moved into the middle and even upper classes of society. Political success continued to grow until the first Irish Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, was elected in 1960, the great-grandson of refugees who had come to America to escape the Great Hunger. Still, despite the lasting impact of the Great Hunger on both the Irish diaspora community and in Ireland, commemorations of the famine took time to take form. An early memorial was created in Canada at Grosse Ile in Quebec. Sorry, they took down my picture. I had a lovely picture of Grosse Ile. A large Celtic cross, which had been erected in 1909 by the Ancient Order of Hibernians, although the site was not recognised as a National Historic Site until the 1970s. In 1998, it was twinned with the National Famine Museum of Stokestown Park, which we saw earlier on, that was Dennis Mahon's house, in Ireland. Since the 150th anniversary of the first appearance of the blight happened in 1995, scholarship and commemoration of the Great Hunger has increased exponentially. The Great Hunger featured prominently too in the nationwide surveys undertaken by the Folklore Commission through the Schools Collection in 1937. The first memorial was created in 1967, along with monuments at that time to Thomas Davis and to Theobald Wolfe-Tone, and there's a statue of the famine at St. Stephen's Green in Dublin. The Irish government has also made a concerted effort to preserve and restore many of those graveyards associated with the workhouses, and there is now an annual National Famine Commemoration event every May. Practically every town in Ireland has local lore associated with the famine, and monuments commemorating the Irish immigrants of that era appear in Liverpool, Sydney, Montreal, Grosse Ile, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, upstate New York too, and Dublin, as well as countless other locations. As the plaque on one of the memorials in a small graveyard outside Listowel in County Kerry says, to the memory of those who died from hunger and the hardship that followed. They died that we may live, we must never forget them. Changes in cultural and political context, as well as distance from the direct history of the Great Hunger, has created a need to engage with the history of the famine. While it is difficult for art to capture the extent of the loss brought on by the Great Hunger, it is left to the museum in Fairfield and their collection, and which now we have upstairs, to continue where time and living memory have left off, and to establish connections between the past and the present. Through art and depictions of the many and varied ways the famine affected the lives of those it touched, the exhibit creates new insights into the memory of the Great Hunger and its impact on the world. And so here's one quote: "Do not think of coming here to view our wretched cabins and our ghastly visages and famine-stricken bodies. You will see nothing to cheer or please you. Not a song is heard from the ploughman or a whistle from the ass driver, but solemn and awful stillness reigns, which seems to forebode some dreadful reaction and frightful commotion," wrote John O'Donovan in a letter to Daniel McCarthy in 1847. And then this was pretty prescient of Lord Bentinck. He said, "The time will come when we shall know what the amount of mortality has been. And though you may groan and try to keep the truth down, it shall be known. And the time will come when the public and the world will be able to estimate at its proper value your management of the affairs of Ireland." So, you know, they weren't without their detractors in 1847, the government, but it was often falling on deaf ears. So I had a slide there of some of the memorials, but that's basically what we're doing upstairs with these exhibits. So the sculptures, some of them are sculptural representations of a lot of John Mahoney's sketches, for instance, but others are ones that were conceived by artists to commemorate, you know, so we have life and death and dying during the Great Hunger, and we also have ones that talk about immigration. So now I'm getting to the questions. So, okay. Yeah. So screenshot, I don't know what that is. All right. Takeaways from the meeting. Don't know what this is. Wow, thanks and holy moly. Who were the speculators who brought up the land merchants? So Regina, well, you know, it's very interesting. Oftentimes, no, you know, sometimes they were just local people who, you know, for whatever reason were ones of the left there. So you didn't have to have a whole pile of money, you know, to buy an entire estate. Of course, you know, some of them were very, very wealthy, you know, doctors or lawyers or merchants. But I know, like in around my hometown and out towards Ballybunion, you know, you can look at the land registers, and families that were there simply increase their holdings. So not necessarily that they buy them at the time, but they can certainly, you know, sign on to rent bigger space. And you know, that's kind of because their neighbors have either died or have left. And so, you know, this is, I think, part of that whole conspiracy of silence around the Great Hunger. You know, if your neighbors literally disappear from the register, you know, but you're able to rent an extra 20 miles or 20 acres, you know, next year. I think a lot of the land ownership didn't really transfer to the poorer people or to those who held the actual leases until the 1870 Land Act was kind of the first, you know, one that allowed people, normal people, we'll say, to borrow money from the government. So what the Encumbered Estate Act does was, you know, get rid of some of those absentee landlords and sort of bring in another class of landlord who was still wealthy but may have been present in Ireland. Not that that was necessarily good, because a lot of these landlords, you know, clear their estates to switch from, we'll say, dairy farming to tillage or that kind of thing. But so really land ownership wasn't revolutionized kind of until the very first Land Act in 1870, and that was followed up by several right the way through, into the 1900s with the Windham Land Act and all of those. And then you said, what steps would have prevented the hunger from being the catastrophe that it was? I mean, I am absolutely not an expert on this or on policy, but it seems to me like, the country was overpopulated. We're still not at 8 million today, in 2025. And so the potato, was very good, like it was very nutritious. Irish peasants, for instance, were more well fed, than European peasants. So Irishmen who fought in the British Army against Napoleon, were recorded as being taller. Women were more fertile because their diet was better than a wheat-based diet. So European peasants were eating bread type thing as a staple, and we were not. We were eating potato. So there was the whole of the society transforms after the famine, where now you see delayed marriages. The British changed the laws too, where you could only have primogeniture, so the oldest son was supposed to inherit. But before this, if a 19-year-old boy wanted to get married, his father would give him an acre. Even if they were kind of poor, they would subdivide their own land, and that starts to change. And then with immigration, taking the oldest son or daughter out, she would go to America or Australia or wherever. So I don't know that anything could have changed the catastrophe, because it just was unfortunate that that bottom third to maybe as high as a third were absolutely dependent on the potato. So when that food source was gone, there was no way to feed them. And sometimes it's very easy to blame the British government, with the policies, like for sure that outdoor relief, didn't do great. But I will say there are accounts all throughout Irish sources of, local people not opening the depot on time, so the food was rotting in there. I know in Listowel's workhouse, the Board of Guardians, had put in the minutes that local farmers were delivering sour milk to the workhouse. And I mean, you would get milk twice a day, every day from cows. So they're obviously selling the good milk elsewhere, and then, chancing their arm by selling sour milk to those who needed it most. So I think, this kind of middlemen were more instrumental in the bad management of relief than just the British government's policy. Okay, Loretto said, thank you so much. I did not know that Trinity evicted, 600 tenants from landed owned. I discovered today that Irish families who did well in the early 20th century were called fine Irish families. Fury said the distinction needed to be made from the not so fine. Yeah, that kind of sounds like one of those, lace curtain and shanty. I don't like those kinds of phrases, but absolutely you're right. I mean, my own great-great-grandfather, or maybe he was one more back, sat on the Board of Guardians in Listowel, and they owned a shop in the town. His brother was an MP for North Kerry. So they weren't kind of millionaires, but, definitely nobody died from the Great Hunger, James, brilliant and horrifying. Yes, thank you. Gaurav Mila Mahagut. Did the effect of the famine impact the land redistribution plans, right, of the Republic post-independence? Yes, Tom. So I kind of addressed that by accident there when I was talking about the Land Acts were absolutely caught up in the Irish Parliamentary Party, before Sinn Féin. So Parnell's party often held the balance of power between 1870 and 1886. So I think there were about 3 Land Acts. I know the first one was 1887. There was another big one in 81, I think. And that basically made government funds available to the farmers who held the leases. And so they were able to buy back. Redistribution, there wasn't really much redistribution going on. I suppose it may have affected the burning of the landlords' houses, which, interesting enough, like really happens on the whole after the War of Independence. You would think that was part and parcel of the great of that struggle, but a lot of the landlords are burnt out after we receive independence. And so there's kind of a massive, and not all of them, of course, would have been pro-British. We're doing work in here at the moment on one of the society members, Anna Frances Levens, and she was married to Thomas Grattan, who was the Earl of Esmond. And he was, a massive Irish patriot, had a huge library of stuff that he collected, and his house was burned to the ground, even though he was a massive sympathizer, like with Irish nationalism. So, I'm not sure if I've answered you properly there. The village I came from in East Clare had a workhouse. Yeah, it was demolished in the 20s. A lot of them were. I never heard the workhouse mentioned by anyone in the village until 10 years ago. Yeah, when Kieran Sheedy did a talk on the Scarf and Tulla Union. Yeah, so this was very common. People knew, like the one in Listowel had actually mainly been bombed during the War of Independence. I think the Black and Tans were using it as a barracks, and so the IRA bombed it. So the wall, the exterior wall is there, and the church, and it's now the hospital and the old folks' home. And across what's now the Ballybunion Road is the Great Hunger burial ground. Tralee became a hospital, St. Catherine's, in the 20th century, and then now it's the tax, local government offices. And that was common throughout. Like some of them are preserved and they're in amazing, falling down kind of, but like amazingly preserved in ways. So there's one that you can visit in, oh God, it's near Boris and Austria. I always forget the name of the town. There's very few that you can get into, but you can visit some of them. And they're well worth visiting because they do feel creepy. There's no doubt about it. But, as I say, they were either used as hospitals, sanitariums. TB was rampant like until the 1920s, and so some towns still have them, but De Valera particularly thought they were a blight on the landscape. Uh, so somebody wants to know who can view this in future. So I'm going to put this on YouTube. You'll be able to see it there. And what is or can be estimated to be the effect of the famine on the Irish who escaped to America and the subsequent descendants of these? Yeah, so it's a phenomenal history. They're doing a lot of work recently on epigenetics and kind of long-term trauma. So it's interesting, I think the Irish are terrible off on the face of things for not talking about things. So, we just talked about the kind of silence that happened in Ireland. And again, I think, a lot of that is sort of embarrassment. Like if we're there today, it meant that we survived, back in the day, or maybe you witnessed horrible things, or maybe you had to do horrible things, to survive. And so even when I was doing research on my hometown in like 2008, 2009, one of the men who supposedly knew a lot of the lore, said to me, "What do you want to know that terrible stuff for, Gerline?" And he didn't want to tell me, and so, but we always knew about our famine graveyard because we would go there every year with the nuns, to say a prayer out at school, because it was right across from our school. So the effect on America sure is untold. Like, this 26% of New York's population, to have been born in Ireland at the time. I mean, just in terms of culturally and politically, you have all of that. Like, so all of these people who came in and worked and really did transform city politics in cities like Boston and New York and Chicago. But then you have this other level, which you're only now starting to look at. And so we might try and get them back. Actually, I had, when I worked at the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, so you'll find it on their YouTube channel, a doctor, I think she's out of Scotland now, but she works on epigenetics, and she was talking about, the long-term effect that just being in the womb at the time, so literally your DNA like is changed because of the trauma. And so high instances like of mental health issues, of alcoholism and stuff like that. There's some fascinating new work, being done and all of that. Portumna, yes. Oh yeah, Portumna do amazing jobs, Loretto. Yeah, they're open, refurbished and open to the public. What is ultimately happening with the Great Hunger Museum artifacts that have been housed at Quinnipiac? And are there legal proceedings continuing? I don't think there's any legal proceedings. Like nothing untoward has happened. The college which owned them made the decision to close the museum, citing demographics and costs and kind of a duty of care to their current students. The collection is I think they ultimately have control of it still, but they are turning over the control to the Ireland's Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield, who are currently fundraising. And irony of all ironies, of course, the building that they have been promised that they can have which used to be a museum building, so it's perfectly set up for this collection, is currently housing a food bank. And of course, they don't want to kick out a food bank. So the collection has been sort of turned into a touring lending collection. So we have 18 pieces, of sculpture on display here until May. But I know it has appeared in like Sacred Heart College. It was up in Albany in the Irish American Heritage Museum. So, it'll be hopefully available. And then as soon as they can, they will open that museum in Fairfield. So Lauren says, to what extent do the folks who immigrated perceive themselves as involuntary exiles from their home country rather than migrants pursuing opportunities and safeties abroad? That's very interesting. Kirby Miller has written, his whole book is kind of about that, like that there was no word in the Irish language for immigrant, that the word was exile. But being an immigrant myself now, and of course under much different circumstances, I sometimes think that like dry scholarship leaves out the lived experience and the agency, of people. So I would imagine that most immigrants, and especially looking at the few sources that we do have, like that talk about the misery at home, and like you have parents writing to children, take us out of this misery and stuff. I think most people, particularly at that time, must just have been grateful that they were able to leave. You know, like I would imagine that every immigrant feels the combination of excitement and nervousness and sorrow, and like it was a big undertaking in 1845, but it also wasn't anything new for a lot of Irish communities. People had been coming out. Well, I mean, there was an Irishman on the ship with Columbus, but they had been coming since the American Revolution, since early 1800s to build the Erie Canal. So, most people, most towns would have had some acquaintance like with immigration and trade even back and forth. So I'm not sure that they saw themselves as like involuntary. Now that's not to say that they didn't carry with them terrible memories or anger like at a system that pushed them out. But I don't know that they would have been all, reluctant to be here. I think most people, especially those poorer ones, must have been just so grateful to get out. And again, like when we look at the numbers, the majority of the people who left from areas that were not experiencing the highest of the deaths. So that tells you that there's an element of wanting to go. That could be two-pronged, of course. Like maybe there was less deaths because more people were shipped out, Um, but I kind of think it looks to me like most people left because they wanted to and were able to, is the second thing. So that means they weren't on the bottom of the bottom at home. Um, I think Cian McMahon is coming on the 5th of February, and he seems to think that the famine was, or the Great Hunger kind of rhetoric was politicized a lot afterwards. So, people like Mitchell and John Devoy would not have, they weren't called coffin ships at the time, for instance, so that phrase was coined, I think, as late as the 1870s, and Cian's work shows, and even though I had some horrible statistics in my talk, Cian shows that like the ships were terrible across the board. It takes a month to come here. They don't have cabins. These are not nice ships. And so but Cian's work shows that Irish people died in as many numbers as did the immigrants from Germany and wherever else. Because if one person has, famine fever or typhus, it's going to spread among the steerage, So am I wandering a little bit? Like I think I'm answering that there, that I think there was much more choice involved in the decision to go than we sometimes give it. Thanks, Lawrence. Okay, good. Thoughtful and nuanced. Yeah, and somebody else just said that it is always more complicated. The story is always more complicated than it's been reduced to, I think, so I definitely it must have been complicated on so many levels for Irish people leaving at the time. If you were a poor peasant, I just think about my own possibly great grandfather, Edward Stack, who sat on the Board of Guardians. Like he wasn't going home at night to no dinner, he did not have any food shortages, I imagine, farmers around the town, butter was at an all-time high, pork was at an all-time high. So for a certain percentage of the population, it must have been life as usual, really. And I mean, even that quote that says, all these parties and stuff that are going on. So it was really only the very, very poor who would have experienced any of this. And a lot of them we know now were Irish speakers. They were way more rural. So like if you're looking at Kerry, they were not always kind of in Listowel. They might have been further down south, like in Kenmare or Dingle or, the peninsulas there. So yeah, very hard to know how to square the whole thing, that I think the people with the most to lose would have died. And so their feelings on the subject have never really been taken into account, you know. Yeah, Loretta says life as usual for some. I absolutely, I think so, you know. Um, it's tragic but true. And you know, when you think about famines today, it kind of carries on, right? You know, that like there's always a class of people that are not experiencing, you know, the discomfort or the want or the suffering and privation. There's a ruling class that are corrupt and or useless, you know. There's people in between trying to do the best they can, but you know, there's corruption in that too sometimes. So I yeah, I think that's the biggest lesson that we can probably learn from the famine, and I didn't kind of reiterate it enough in my talk, that the lessons are, you know, that it is still happening. I mean, even in a city like New York, to have food deserts in a city, you know, is kind of crazy. I know when I lived up in Albany, downtown Albany, you know, there were very few grocery stores. You really needed a car, like, to get to a big grocery store because any of the little corner stores did not have vegetables or fruit, you know, for sale. When I lived in Woodlawn, we didn't have a store for a long time because the Seatown closed. You had to, and again, it was, you know, a bit of a hike up to the A&P. Um, so like within a very prosperous kind of part of the Bronx, you know, unless you went to the local butcher shop or those kinds of things, or had a car to go someplace else, there wasn't a grocery store. So I think these issues are always class related, you know, rather than religion or ethnically related. That's a big long lecture there. So does anyone have any other comments or questions? So I think our next event is online on the 31st. We're doing it at 12 o'clock in the day because we're our speakers from Ireland. We've got Dr. Niamh Wycherley. Thank you, from Maynooth University. Thanks, Loretta. And she's going to be talking about the real St. Bridget. And then on the 4th, we're in here with creative women and just celebrating St. Bridget and our matron saint. And then on the 5th, if you're in New York, we'll have Cian McMahon live in the Society. But I would recommend, if anybody wants to go to the Irish American Heritage Museums, you can go to the website and just look up past events, or you can go to their YouTube channel. We had him during COVID and he gave an excellent talk. So if you're not able to come to his talk here on the 5th of February, for sure, tune in on the online there, because we can't record them here. The quality just isn't good enough. And then on the 21st, we have Loretta O'Leary from Ireland's Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield coming in to give a talk about the Staten Island quarantine station and how refugees were treated appallingly, because, you know, refugees and bringing in disease, and we don't want their sort in my backyard. And so the quarantine station was burnt. So Loretta will talk about that. And there's a mass grave out on the island as well, under, I don't know if it's under a parking lot or a golf course now. I think it was been, two things were shifted. So good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't think there's any more comments or questions, but you can raise your hand if you'd like. We had a good few on tonight, so I'm delighted to see all the numbers out. And I hope you're all staying warm. But thank you, and do tune in. Oh, Eileen, are you wanting to ask a question? Let me just see. I might be able to allow you to talk, Eileen. Did you have a question or?
Yes. So, hi, how are you? Thank you so much. So, yes, yeah, you skipped over it. So, my parents were born in the early 1900s. When they came, they never told us, growing up in New York, never heard about the famine. So, were they even aware? Were they taught in school? Did they talk about it then? That would have been, they were born in the early 1900s.
That's very interesting. So I can tell you that we only learned about the Great Hunger. I went to school in the 80s and 90s in primary school, and then the leaving certificate and junior, like your secondary school education, skipped over the famine. So I, I think in an independent Ireland, which was a little bit before their time, we did not need any more reasons, to be anti-British. So I genuinely think they kind of curtailed how much we learned about the Great Hunger. But I think by 1900, they probably would have, in a sort of an unofficial capacity. So there was schooling, the British system. We had actually free second primary education before Britain did, in an effort, I guess, to create good citizens for England. But so I don't know how official, the curriculum would have been about it, but honestly, by 1900, you couldn't escape knowledge, because there would have been workhouses or deserted villages, like there, all over Ireland. Still, there are these abandoned homes, which echo from that time. So I think there would have been a fair amount of folklore about it. But how much individual, like, one of the comments that precipitated my own research into it in 2007, I was out for dinner. I was at home for the summer and I was out for dinner with my parents and some of their friends, and an older man, I think I ordered crab as a starter. And he said to me, "Oh my God, that's famine food. My grandmother would never allow us to eat crab." And I was like, wow, like it's, it's a kind of a delicacy and it's expensive, And I had never heard that, but he had grown up. So if he was kind of 65 at that time, his grandmother was obviously older again. And so there would have been those kinds of stories told, I think, in families, or again, you would have had the mass graveyards, and that's kind of borne out by the testimonies that people collected in 1937 in that schools project. So they sent kids home to ask their older neighbors or their grandparents what were their memories or had they heard stories, and everybody had a story. That's a really good collection, by the way, that you can search. It's on the UCD website, University College Dublin's website, but it might also be called Ducas. It's the heritage, papers, so, and they're searchable. James is saying a chief reason for the creation of the Irish Arts Centre in Manhattan in the 1970s was the fact that Irish Americans were not very Irish, because like myself, my parents, who were children of immigrants, did not share their knowledge of Irish culture, history, etc. Yeah. And, honestly, James, like that's kind of true of even like the salvation of the Irish language came because of the Irish in America, like we had these Celtophile societies and Irish language societies, which of course then were very embraced by the independent government, when we, particularly De Valera's government, from 26 on. But yeah, it's interesting. And, things like Michael Flatley's Irish dance revolutionized it and made it more popular than the Irish dance that was kind of beaten into me at school, So sometimes it does take a couple of generations for it to come back, into favor, or, and I suppose too, first and second generation immigrants, maybe they're busy trying to make a life or trying to assimilate, as an immigration historian, I don't like that term assimilate, but I'm sure, in 1900, there was a little bit of pressure to, like Catholicism was not like the KKK reformed in the early 20th century, attacking, Catholics and as well as Jews and Black people. And so, there was a lot about your identity that you had to kind of smother a little bit so that you could be perceived as a good American. And particularly in those early decades of the 20th century, when they're starting to limit immigration in the Johnson-Reed Act, there's huge talks in the early 20th century about what makes a good American, who do we want in here, and the Irish were not part of the who do we want group. We were seen as a pugnacious and idolatrous, backward-looking, clannish, style. And yeah, as Carolyn says, just like World War II veterans never talked about their experiences. Absolutely. I think particularly, look, you hardly even hear historians talking about, the cannibalism that happened when we know what happened, so there's a lot of difficult topics that society in general kind of didn't tackle, I think. So yeah, sorry for missing your question earlier on, Eileen. There was big...
Quite all right.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so thank you all for hanging out. Oh my God, we've been on for an hour and a half. But thank you, I really appreciate it. And I'll see some of you on the 5th or again online on the 31st. Okay, so take care, everyone. Have a good night. And thanks again.